in transforming your ideas to a script play, which is primarily the subject matter of this call, how would you say for structurally for someone who is thinking about screenwriting, what are
Mm.
those elements that you have to put in place to be able to take your idea to a script, to a production ready script?
Sure. That's quite a loaded question, I
Yeah.
guess. I mean, the first for me would be grit and determination.
Mm,
When you decide upon a quest of telling a particular story, it it's a marriage. You are married to that concept and that idea. And it's a commitment of saying, I am going to go with you wherever the storm will take me and however long it takes in order for me to be able to tell the story. That's the first part for me. It's the commitment. It's because essentially that is what will fundamentally determine whether your story gets told or not. I believe the ones that don't get told are the ones that essentially give up. Um, the stories that you're dying to tell, you'll get out eventually. But in terms of the process itself,
mm,
you cannot write story, in my opinion, without starting with characters. You need to define whom we are seeing this perspective, whose perspective are we seeing the world from, and what is their journey. Without determining that, you essentially will end up going around in circles and probably compiling a lot of conflated ideas without a throughput line. It's a very important thing because if you have honed in on your characters and you know who they are and why do they do what they do, then in the process, in the journey of the writing, there's always a clear line
yeah.
because that line is defined by the eyes of the character that you've chosen to use for us to see the world in, or that particular world in. So to me, it's a grappling with that first. You decide, okay, I want to tell the story, I don't know, about, I don't know, the
Mhm.
Biafra War, right? Um, that's a pretty big subject.
Very.
Yeah, exactly. So until you hone in on what is the eye that was seeing that experience through, it becomes conflated and not directed. But if you tell me that the story is about, I don't know, a 17-year-old teenage girl who experiences the trauma of warfare and was seeing it through her eyes and her journey. And what is she trying to do? Get away to safety. All of a sudden, you have a quest, a very clear cause and effect chain that sits in the boundary of what we know and understand to be story. And all of a sudden, that big subject matter, an entire war, is all of a sudden now brought into the eyes of a little 17-year-old girl and her quest and what she's trying to go through. So for me, your protection when you tell a story is to cover yourself in the clarity of your character and or characters
Yeah.
and what it is that they're trying to do. That will essentially give you the flow. So once you've done your character breakdowns, and they should, in my view, be as detailed as possible.
Yeah.
Sometimes you might even end up with a Bible of these characters and who they are, and it might even be bigger and thicker than your script's going to end up being. And that's absolutely encouraged because what it is you are unpacking the psychology of your character or characters. You're unpacking what makes them tick. Why do they do the things that they do? And you'll find once you've made these decisions about each and every one of your characters, when you get to the writing, whenever you get to points where you are maybe stuck in terms of events or where to go, then you reference your characters. You look at your character and be like, okay, what would John, whom I've defined in this manner as being, I don't know, short-tempered, insecure, you've given him all these characteristics, right? So then how is someone who is short-tempered and insecure going to, I don't know, for instance, deal with breakup? Or let's say her husband cheats on her. If we know who she is, then we are going to be able to understand how she will react to the circumstances that you throw in front of her. Because you've defined her psychology way before you started to actually write the story. So for me, it's everything, the characters. And depending obviously on how complex your story is, it defines your research. So because in you deciding this is the character, then when you go and research aspects, it's because you are being directed by wanting to build this character further than they are. If you have a character that works offshore on an oil rig, okay, most of us, unless you've had the experience of working on an oil rig or have a dad or somebody, very rare experience of having someone who has that as a background, we know nothing about life or people who work on oil rigs, right?
Yeah.
So then how do you fill that gap? Then your research is directed based on the fact that you've defined your character. So it sets your quest, your different missions in order to fulfill the whole in terms of what you'll be able to do. So once you're done with the characters and the research that will stem from that, then you build it towards your screenplay. My approach to screenplay, which is not necessarily unique in any way, that many people use it. After I've done the characters and I've done my research, when I say research, it's an important aspect for me to, as much as possible, put my foot down in the space and places that I'm trying to tell the story of. Okay, so I've made my characters, I've created the characters, but then now after that, I need to step in the space. Obviously, sometimes there might be limitations. If I'm telling a story about being on the moon, it'll be a bit difficult to get there. However, what you do is you put yourself in the environments that that help elicit an understanding of the world that you're about to create as much as possible. I prefer doing it after, like I said, after the characters, because what it does is, when I wrote the characters, or I came up with the characters, I didn't have the reference of reality.
Mm.
But now, when I get the reference of reality, I'm putting that against my characters and my own ignorance. So it's almost like I'm able to measure my assumptions that I would have made about a world that I've never been in. Let's say I set a story in Port Harcourt in Nigeria, okay? And here I am in Johannesburg using Google, using whatever little means that I have, my Nige friend. I've got a few, I'm looking around and I'm trying to connect, you watching YouTube, whatever I can, right? And I write the story, all from Johannesburg. Never been to Port Harcourt for 1 second. I guarantee you, the day I step into Port Harcourt, for whatever the circumstances, it will change that story.
True.
It'll affect it in the most fundamental way. So for me, in order to be aware of that effect, I like to measure it against the experience of the space. I like to measure it against my ignorance and assumptions with what I wrote without having been there. It's quite important that I have the two to measure. I don't want just the one experience. So once then I touch ground, I need to also open myself up to the possibility that my characters are going to evolve and change based on now having research that is more tangible, so to speak. I know more about this world that I'm telling a story of. If we're telling a story about doctors in a busy government hospital, you can write all you want, but until you walk into such a hospital, it's going to affect you the day that you do. It's going to have a huge impact on the story that you conceptualize. I guarantee it. So allow yourself, rather play games with it. See it as it is the reality that it is. That chances are when you start with story, whether you're being commissioned or not, chances are with the research, you don't get the opportunity of being exposed as much as possible to what you want. So accept that condition and work in your ignorance until such time that you have the ability to go and touch the spaces that you are conceptualizing, and then be willing to be affected by it. Mm-hmm. It's very important. Once that is in play, my next step then is to do a bullet point form of the entire story. So I will conceptualize, I'll sit there, I'll put up boards. And when I say bullet point, I'm saying describing my story in as few words as possible, but describing every action from beginning to end. So it becomes points. But what we tend to do in this process as writers is we don't do the bullet point. We end up writing paragraph after paragraph of what this is. But what we don't see in doing that is that we're now creating a conflation of ideas without honing in on exactly what something is. If you can't tell me in 2 sentences what a scene is about, then I question the scene. I even question your understanding of what that scene is because of that fact. And for me, the best way to be able to really get in there, put your arms up, roll your sleeves up, and be able to play with the material, is that you have to accept your limitations rather than be in denial of them. And the best way to do that is to be very succinct and describe things in the shortest form. If you are taking more words to describe a scene, then that's not what the scene is about. It means to a large degree that even you yourself, you're not quite aware of what it is. Once you do the bullet point needs to be literally as short as possible sentences that describe every scene of your film all the way to the end. What I usually do is I do them in cards. So I'll put up a paper and I'll literally write just the sentence of what that scene is, what the essence of that scene is. And I'll put it up on the wall as a card. It's quite important for me so that I can see it at distance. The reason for it is when I look at the entirety, then once I've done all of my scenes in the same way, if you can imagine all of these pieces of paper, if a page represents a scene, then you allow yourself, before you've even written, the opportunity to edit your story, to be able to look at its rhythm, to be able to look at its effectiveness and its flow. Because in literally point form, you've given each sequence of events. So now, once you have all the events, you're able to look and say, oh, that event is unnecessary. Let me take it out. And literally, you walk over to your wall and you rip out the page, you know? It's very important to try, and the reason for these types of exercises is to try and give you as much of a bird's eye view of your story and your process as possible. The reason for that, why do you need a bird's eye view? It's because also we need to be conscious, I believe, of the fever that we all suffer from as writers. I believe there's an overconscious kind of cloud, if I had to describe it, that sits above you when you are in quest mode with the story that you tell, to such a degree that you cannot see it. It's too close. And the unfortunate thing also sometimes with writing is that we equate effort and hard work towards good writing, but it doesn't necessarily work that way. You could work your butt off, literally. You could work so hard on something, yet that doesn't mean that you've applied the right and correct process that allows you to come out on the other side with a good piece of work or writing. But I believe if you play exercises, games with yourself that allow you to pull back as much as possible so that you see it from a distance as much as possible, you'll be the better for it. So that's why the bullet points are important and why I would stick them on the wall. When I'm writing deep in it, I mean, my whole entire walls are filled with these little cards, but I can see them in one line. Oh, okay, that's what that scene is. That's what it represents. So then it allows me then to literally edit off the wall. So that at the end of that process, I have my entire sequence of story on the wall before I picked up the typewriter or the computer to write. Too often with writers, we tend to try and figure out the story whilst we're writing, in the words, which is the scariest thing you could ever do. The actual writing process, I'm talking about when you are typing words, putting them together, all that should literally be something almost on the level of that you can dictate and give to somebody else to do. It's just a process. It shouldn't be the heart of this creative thing. You should have figured out your story already by then. To sit with words and twist them around, use this word to say this and that word to say that, because you're trying to figure out story, that's not storytelling. Because now you're going to muddle up the concept because you're trying to figure it out on the go. You should have figured it out in bullet point form. You should have planned. You need to set a map. That's what it is. The bullet points is a map for your endeavor. This is where I'm going to go. This is where I'm going to go. This is where I'm going to go with my story. But quite often, we get so caught up in the process that we jump these steps. And you may not realize it in the immediate, but in jumping the steps, you are actually putting yourself at a great disadvantage. Because what you're doing is you're going to then end up sitting there trying to figure a story out. That's why you end up sitting in front of your computer for 3 hours, 4 hours sometimes, and you haven't written stitch. And then you end up going onto YouTube and Instagram and everything else. Before you know it, the day's over and you haven't written anything significant. And you're still trying to figure it out. You can't understand why it's not coming. It's because you haven't set the coordinates. There's no map. You cannot put yourself in a space where you're figuring out the story in the writing. The writing is just a process to finish it off. It should have been written already. through your map. So you should really then the writing process, the screenwriting process, should be probably the easiest part if you've done the work, because all you're doing it's practically transcribing, because you've already set those tones, you've already played games with, because when you have the cards, you can shift them around as well in terms of sequence. That's why I said there's a level of, it's editing basically. So you're editing your sequences of how you will tell this particular story. And in doing that, by the time you get to the actual computer or typewriter to put the words down, the story is in place. Try to fight for that as much as possible. And it doesn't have to be the cards, people. You could write literally notes as well, as long as you can see them in as short descriptions as possible. Then you are able to move them around. But imagine if I had 6 scenes and each one instead you wrote me a paragraph for. How am I going to edit that in my mind? Remember, I need to be able, it doesn't matter where I am. I could be taking kids to school, could be walking dogs, whatever you're doing, you are always writing. You're always writing. Doesn't matter what the actual action is, but you are always writing. Whether you're walking down the street, driving your car, in the gym, you're writing. So what you then need to do is enhance that process of saying, it's not always about when I have pen to paper or sitting in front of a computer. Then what are the exercises that I can play or set up for myself, so that when I'm not writing with pen and paper, how am I wrestling with my ideas? Which is why you need to have short, succinct descriptions of your scenes, whether they're in a notebook, in your back pocket, or on a wall as cards. You should be constantly grappling with the effect of where you want to put what. And then, as I said, then you go, if you've done your preparations, then go through the process of writing. You in the actual the script writing aspect of it should be the easiest if you've prepared. And then after that, in terms of the process, then really it's about your relationship with your producers in terms of getting it to the next step.
So Jahmil, I love how I've seen your stories, your work are really, they're heavy. They have strong backgrounds to the theme that you're working with. The narratives are not simple in a sense, but you're still able to create the individuality in your characters, and the world that they are set in does not swallow them. How are you able to find that balance? Because, so many people, when they want to tell like a big story wherein there is this probably a strong cultural shift or an historical event, and that has affected their character, and that's the story they want to tell, they get swept away in the plot and the grand event. And so the journey is not so, we're not carried along anymore. So, but for you, I see a perfect yin yang. And when I watched So the Winter to My Skin, there was a time when I just stopped looking at the screen and just listening. And there were not many dialogue, but I could feel the movement from the plot points. I could feel us moving to a new dimension without even having so many dialogue there to drive me. And I wasn't looking directly at the screen. So how are you able to find balance for, the world of the story and the individuality of the character that is driving that story when telling heavily themed story like you used to?
I think for me, there is no difference between the two, between character and the world of the character. The one defines the other. So if I say to you, my cocoon is character, right? If I focus on the character, then you'll know about the world and the world that they inhabit. So if we were talking just now about, we made the example of the Biafra War. Big subject, but it's not a story. Do you get what I mean? It's a theme. It's an element of a world. It's an event that affects characters. So if I start with a character, the character is affected. What is the character affected by? The torments of warfare. Oh, warfare? What warfare? Oh, this war. Oh, this circumstance. Oh, da, da, da. And then the world is built from there. But it's got to start with the character. Star Wars is nothing without Luke Skywalker. Forget about all of the spectacle that happens around it. But the focus is at core is the story of a young man who does not know who and what he is, and is about to engage a reality that he was destined to be great. That's the core of it. Where it happens and the circumstances of it are going to be those unique circumstances that are the world. But for me, to a large degree, they tell themselves once I know who my character is. Because in getting to know my character, then it's demanding me to know and understand very specific things about that world. So rather than trying to consume the entirety of the world, trying to understand it and the like, I would rather concentrate on trying to understand it from the perspective of the character that I have. So if the character that I have is, for instance, we're talking research now. If the character that I have is a 16-year-old girl, right? Because I'm going to be seeing the world through her eyes, it then changes the nature of my research, even if the subject matter is the same. So even if I'm researching the Biafra War, but it'll pull me further to a very specific aspect of the Biafra War, which is the impact on women of the torment of that war. Now, can you see how, or even further, the impact on young women?
Yeah.
And its impact of that specific war. Now, what that has done is taken the whole pie of the world of the Biafra War, and it's made me hone in on a very specific aspect of it, chunk of it. As we well know, the vulnerable are the most affected with warfare. Mm-hmm. But now my research in terms of what I'm trying to get out of the Biafra War, it's not the whole pie all of a sudden. It's very, very specific. Yeah. Because of the character that I'm trying to, whose story I'm trying to tell. And all of a sudden, it doesn't become so large anymore in terms of the scope of what I'm after. It becomes very focused. Okay. And that is driven, again, by character. Yeah. So it's a blanket on many, many levels where you find that it takes you in the direction that you need to, especially when you world build, because we spend too much time, I believe, with exposition. Way too much time. The exposition is in the doing. It's in the doing of the character.
Yeah.
I can't be spending time, and I get it from a novel perspective. It's the style of novels and a certain type of literal material that demands long prose and descriptions of the essence of where we are and who we are. But if we're talking in the world of cinema, for instance, in the context of that, it's a cause and effect chain that we're trying to read of events that tell us about the whole, a succession of events that tell us about the whole. And because of that, there is no time for it. We have to hone in on that 16-year-old girl and her very specific plight and how she deals with that plight. And in her tussling with it, we will get to know the world that she's in and the world that she inhabits.
Great. This
Hope
is,
that helps.
yeah, it's so helpful. And it's actually segues into what I want to ask next about visual storytelling. And I see you do it effortlessly, you know, because that the essence and what really separates screenwriting from other forms is the fact that it's a very visual medium. And so there are techniques that you use where you're able to make your story as visual as possible and less driven by dialogue and exposition, like you've just, explained.
Sorry, so what is the point about that?
The techniques you use in making your story more visual, yeah.
Well, it's all visual, it would be my argument. Anything that you write is visual. Because what are you trying to do? You're trying to paint a picture.
Yes.
You're trying to put a picture in my head. So what we do as writers is visual. It's a visualization of something, right? So for me, I've always seen it and felt it from that perspective. And if that be the case, whether I choose to use a piece of dialogue or put just an image there, it's the same thing. So I've never, from a cinematic perspective, I've never interpreted cinema in a way where I've felt that words need to lead the process, because an image is doing just that. And how do you get to that image on the page? You have to write it still in the same way that you would write a piece of dialogue to do the same thing. What is the piece of dialogue for? Hardly ever is it just frivolous talk. We put exposition in dialogue, we put context in dialogue, we put descriptions of our world. We rely on dialogue for that. But I would put it to you that it can and is abused by many who profess to be storytellers and writers. Dialogue, I mean.
Mm-hmm.
But a huge part of our existence as humans has no dialogue. As much as we speak, we don't speak.
Mm-hmm.
And the nature of what you see, hear, touch, smell isn't always about spoken words. So when you write, you are painting images, constantly describing images, describing things for one to see. And quite often, think about the moments when you get to dialogue. It tends to slightly move away from that. It tends to start moving away from that and gets into the world of exposition. And that's why a lot of the times when we try to write natural dialogue as writers, we struggle with it. Very few of us are good at that skill. I've given up on it. I don't see the point. No, not in a script writing perspective. As a screenwriter, I just write the rudimental elements that I need. Okay, this is the fundamentals of it. But I'm not going to get the rhythm of them. I'm not going to focus and fixate on the rhythm of that dialogue. Because that's what the actors are going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to do it way better than anything I can conceptualize in the middle of the night in my isolated space. So to me, I write in a way where it's almost an invitation to the actors to take the words and try to embody them and then make them their own. So I don't fixate as much on dialogue. Maybe, and I hope to get such that I get the opportunity of working on a piece that is about that. But I also do feel it's an antiquated way of storytelling. Think Shakespeare. Beautiful. The prose are insane. They're beautiful. I'm a huge fan of Shakespeare. But so much of his writing, so much of his cause and effect chain of event motion happens in the people's words. Not even his words, but their words, in what they say. And that's why a person can almost even pause from the events that are happening in a Shakespeare play, and then he goes into a personal dialogue that we get to hear. That's a very specific style that I believe we haven't really, at least in a traditional sense, articulated and identified. That's actually a certain style of communicating through story, where vocalizing it through a character's words helps you tell the story, mostly through exposition of why we are here. Why are we here? And that's why we, in a modern context, I believe, we tend to struggle with a lot of it, because we've adopted an antiquated form of storytelling, which is why in the commercial context, when the advent of people like Quentin Tarantino came into the space, everyone was like, "Whoa, this man is so smart. He has such an ability to write dialogue that is so natural and flowing and blah, 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 blah." But what all that Tarantino does with his dialogue, which is part of a big part of why, not all, but a big part of why on a commercial level, the world has gravitated towards it, is that he doesn't use, at least on the surface, he doesn't use a dialogue for didactic exposition. It's not for that reason that he uses dialogue. Instead, he uses it for the rhythm of character, for character to come out. So the dialogue tends to not be the dialogue of the action, cause and effect chain of what he's saying in the story at that particular time. So, as with the great Pulp Fiction, you'll have two guys talking about the most frivolous thing, yet their action is to kill somebody. And on a commercial level, people really gravitated to that kind of treatment. They were like, "Oh, well, this is really, really cool," and what have you. But all it was doing, not all, but what it was also doing was that part of its success was that it was a relief to modern day audiences to be able to enjoy dialogue that doesn't hit them over the head with information as to where we are and why we're doing what we're doing.
There is a question here from Basi, and he's saying, are all stories worth telling? That he's of the notion that some stories are a complete waste of time. If so, how do you decide stories that are worth your time?
For me, it's the perspective that story has. What resonates with me is whose eyes are we seeing any particular narrative from? Thanks. And from whose perspective are we seeing things from? Because that usually is what inspires me to take on any particular narrative or story, is to say, do I champion that voice, that perspective? Is it a perspective that I want to see on screen in any form or way? And then that's what drives me and helps me fall in love with a particular narrative. It has to resonate with you, whatever story you want to tell. Because if it doesn't, you're not going to have the required juice to push through, persevere, and fight to make it happen. Because that's also part of the process. Yeah.
So can you discuss briefly with us, Jahmil, what's been your most rewarding project so far, and why that project? What are the lessons from that project you could share with us?
Without getting sounding too vague, they're all have been rewarding and equally so. Because again, which is the emphasis of what I was trying to say to Rachel's question, you gotta set a quest in front of you. So a quest is about facing challenges and overcoming those challenges. So it's in the overcoming that you get your personal prize, so to speak. So every time that I complete a work, that in itself is the prize. So I can't pull out one particular piece and be like, oh, that one. No, every time, because every time I put a mountain in front of myself, and every time I'm scared, every time I don't know how I'm gonna get past it. But that's exactly why I put it there. So when I get past it, it's the effect is insane for me on a personal level in terms of what I gain, because I've achieved something that I didn't think I could every time.
Evelyn says, "Hi, Jahmil. Have you ever adapted a novel into a screenplay? Is the planning sequence different, given that your characters and location are already set out in your narrative?"
I have. It never got made, but I adapted a book. No, the process wasn't that far off. Yes, in the adaptation, it's the characters are set, but you still need to identify them. So you still need to pull them out of the work and put them on your page and break them down on your page as far as you understand them. So before you write the adaptation, you've got to start with all of those characters in the book and break them down and make sure that you fully understand who and what they are, so that when you do that, then they start becoming yours. That's where the handover happens. And that's when now it becomes your work and no longer someone else's work, which you are adapting. And that's important to happen. You can't always be in this major reverence of the work of the written work that you are adapting, such a point that it doesn't feel like yours. Then I think you're going to struggle with your adaptation. But before you get to that, you need to have a deep understanding of the work. And the way to do that is to really understand its characters. So I still start at the same place to answer the question.
So more on visual writing. This is from Charles. How detailed can I go in situations where directors say you are too descriptive? So he's saying that when he's writing more of visual than dialogue, how detailed can he be on his scenes?
He can be as detailed as he wants. But what you always need to be aware of is the readability of your script. I have a shooting draft, which is way more dense. It feels more like a novel than the screenplay that I share mostly with finances and people that I'm trying to attract to the project. That is mostly for pre-production prep, for artists, for my a cinematographer, for my production designer, for anyone whom I'm collaborating with. I give them the more dense version, which has as detailed descriptions as I want, you know what I mean? And that helps them build the world that I need them to see. But the script that you are sending to finances, commissioning editors, the like, try to make it as readable as possible. Make it a light read, so to speak. I, for instance, have a rule. I don't write more than 4 sentences together to make a paragraph. Anything longer than 4 sentences before I break for a paragraph, even for the eye, is not palatable. The eye looks at it and sees just, oh, okay, I got to read through. What is this saying? It becomes a challenge. And presentation is everything with a screenplay. It's got to look like something that says, hey, you busy executive with money, take 2 hours and just look at this. It'll entice you. And guess what? It will require the least amount of effort from you. But when I open the first page and I've got a dense paragraph that is 7, 8 lines, I'm already thinking about other things. I'm already thinking, I don't want to read this. So presentation and how it looks and how you play with words from one line to the next is how you are going to entice and keep a reader. And your story could be great, but if it's hard to access through the reading, then you're not going to connect with the people that you want to, which are chances are the money people, if I'm understanding the question.
Yeah, definitely the money people. So, Of Good Report was banned by your government. How did you feel about that? And what
I was
advice?
embarrassed. I was embarrassed. I was embarrassed for them. I was like, oh, what are you people doing? Wake up. And eventually
Yeah.
they woke. That was just being stupid. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, what advice would you have for filmmakers who are trying to tell rebellious stories like this?
I would say study the medium.
Mm.
Understand the medium that you are trying to work with. It's a tool, like any tool. It's like a pen, but just a complicated, expensive one. And that requires more than one person. Understand its rules, how it works, study what came before,
Exactly.
know your history so that you can understand the context of where you sit in that hole.
Mm.
And, play. We live in a world today where we have all this access to technology, yet we don't practice our craft. We only want to do the craft when the money is there. And that to me is a challenge because it says you're not giving yourself the opportunity to actually grow and be good at what you do. You should constantly be writing, whether it's being commissioned or not, whether it's paid work or not. But you got to flex this muscle constantly, all the time, for it to grow and be anything. Also, remember there are people out there, your competitors throughout the world, usually of a lighter hue and skin, are eons ahead of you in terms of this craft and understanding what you can do with it. So that as people of color, we have even that obligation as Black people on this continent that has failed to tell its story, yet it's got the greatest story to tell.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because us as the storytellers, we haven't mastered our craft yet. And that should haunt us. That should be the thing. Master the craft. Because once you do, then it just becomes an extension of yourself. That's what you want. You want it to be an extension of yourself without even thinking about it, subconsciously. So that then you can throw yourself in your creativity, in your stories, and not have to worry about how. Demystify the how.
Mm.
So that you can finally engage story. Because our problem is we're trying to engage story, which is one thing, but at the same time, we're doing it while we're still trying to figure out how story is told. And we're trying to do it at the same time. And then we wonder why it's not quite working out.
Mm. Great. What would you advise writers who want to take screenwriting as a career? What path can they take to really get the best out of this profession, which would be that's why we are here. Most of us are doing this professionally.
After you've done I don't know, an ABC on writing course, maybe like as short as possible, maybe like a 3 to 6 month course max on writing, because there's no need to really try and figure this thing out. It's not brain surgery. Go and study something else. Go and study the things that you want to talk about. Because the biggest problem with us storytellers is we have no stories. What we take out is lives lived, experiences lived. And it's either why do we pick up a certain book? It's either we seeking knowledge or we're seeking information that is going to open us up to something that we did not know. So we are being conscientized. And if quite often the people who are doing the conscientizing in the context of us as writers aren't conscious, the more you spend and invest in educating and yourself through traditional education, but also culture and life experience, the more interesting you are. And then you're worth telling a story. You know, the great writers are all people who have perspectives on things because they have lived life, or are experts or studied something that we do not have or know. So when we gravitate towards story or good story, it's because we are either being taken into worlds or experiences that we know nothing about, or that resonate with us, but there's an expectation that the storyteller knows that world more than the one who's consuming it. And when that chain is broken, when you question your storyteller as the viewer or as the reader, who's this writer? The chain is broken.
Yeah.
Then they're no longer in your world. They're no longer in your hands, and you're not taking them through that journey anymore. So I guess my advice is, let's be better at who we are. Cultivate ourselves in order for the output that we give to the world to be at its most premium. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.